Hello, everybody. Hope everyone can hear me okay. Thank you for joining the First Amendment Museum tonight for Let Truth Have Fair Play, Elihu Palmer's Struggle for Religious Freedom with Professor Kirsten Fischer. This is part of the First Amendment Museum's online speaker series. If you're attending one of our free presentations for the first time, the First Amendment Museum is a nonpartisan nonprofit located in Augusta, Maine. I'm Max Nospish, the manager of visitor experiences at the First Amendment Museum. We rely on generous gifts from viewers like you to continue the work we do. So if you enjoy the presentation tonight, please consider donating to us. Also, check out our website for future speaker series installments, events, film screenings, along with other great content and opportunities. Tonight, I'm very happy to be joined by Professor Kirsten Fischer from the University of Minnesota. She recently wrote American Freethinker, Elihu Palmer and the Struggle for Religious Freedom in the New Nation, which I had the pleasure of reading and is going to be the subject of tonight's presentation. She's also known for her book, Suspect Relations, Sex, Race, and Resistance in Colonial North Carolina. North Carolina is my home state, so I guess I need to check that out. And I'm sure it's great after reading this past book, so I encourage all of you guys to check that one out too. Fischer is an award-winning teacher and the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships. She has presented her work all over the world in France, Italy, Germany, and Canada. She was hosted for 2 years at the University of Heidelberg Center for American Studies, once as a Fulbright scholar. If you have any questions for Professor Fischer tonight, please put them in the chat if you're on Zoom, and in the comment section if you're watching on Facebook. Professor Fischer, thanks for joining us, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Max. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. And thanks to the First Amendment Museum for this invitation. This is a very special invitation. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate what you do. It is so important for Americans to understand the crucial significance of the First Amendment freedoms and the ways in which these are hard won. They need to be reenacted all the time in order for them to be real and not just rhetoric. It's pretty clear that freedom of religion and freedom of speech about religion are under attack right now. And it seems to me not so much by the government or by the law so much as by citizens themselves. There seems to be a heightened intolerance for hearing opposing views about religion, and what we get then is cancel culture. And that is true even among academics and also in the classroom. And I imagine that those of you here on this call tonight have been reading about the scandal that's unfolding just north of where I'm zooming in from here in St. Paul, Minnesota at Hamline University, where a Muslim student objected to being shown an iconic and reverential 14th century painting of the Prophet Muhammad, claiming that despite the advance notices, she was not able to opt out of seeing it. And what happened next is that the administration quickly called the slide with the image Islamophobic. And Hamline President Miller declared in an email to all Hamline employees that, quote, respect for the observant Muslim students in that classroom should have superseded academic freedom. The adjunct who was teaching that art history course did not have her contract renewed for the spring. She's now suing Hamline, and Hamline is trying to walk back their statement that that academic freedom should really be subservient to other forms of respect. So interesting that this is happening now. But even as, or even before being canceled, people are engaging more and more, I think, in self-censorship, and for good reason in some ways, because they fear reprisals made possible by weaponized media. At my university, for example, an adjunct professor in spring 2019 was teaching a course on Marx, and a student who was not in that class wrote a report for Campus Reform, which is an organization in Virginia that trains and pays students to write reports about what they consider liberal bias in the classroom, whatever that might mean to them. Any report unleashes a barrage of hate mail, death threats, and that's exactly what happened to the adjunct professor at University of Minnesota teaching that course on Marx. Her computer was doxxed. Her life was made miserable. So if we know that we might have a campus reform reporter in our classroom, how will that affect how we teach? Will we maybe teach more carefully? Maybe we leave out the lecture on the Tea Party or the Koch brothers. So both these things, cancel culture and self-censorship, are directly at odds with the messy tussle that a democracy requires of us. We have to be able to tolerate and let stand differences of opinion for democracy to work. And of course, you know this already because you're with the First Amendment Museum. But this is what I mean to say is that how Americans think about these freedoms, how Americans maybe tend to take them for granted or give them up too quickly is of crucial importance in this moment now. And always has been, right? So let me now get to my subject for today, a man named Elihu Palmer, who dealt with some of these issues already in the 1790s. Max called him Elihu. That's completely legit. It can be spoken both ways. Elihu, Elihu. I like Elihu. I think it has a little bit more gravitas. But anyway, that's what I call him. Palmer, Elihu Palmer, gradually, really rather reluctantly, and actually initially inadvertently became a kind of public free thinker, religious free thinker and speaker in the early decades of the United States. That's what my book is about. And I think his story is really remarkable for the very hard knocks he received for speaking out in the 1790s about his religious opinions. And it's remarkable for the ways that he rebounded from those hard knocks. He did not intend to become a flashpoint in the nation's first culture wars. And he certainly didn't enjoy being slandered as an infidel or shunned as a dangerous person. But once he found himself in that position, he leaned into his role as a public freethinker, and he asserted his right to speak freely in public spaces. And I think it's worth knowing his story because of the ways that he claimed his right to free speech by enacting it. And he did this at a time when the freedoms of the First Amendment were more aspirational than they were really established. They hadn't yet been legislated, and they were more experimental than culturally esteemed. So who was this Elihu Palmer? Well, he grew up in a very tiny village in Connecticut. He probably couldn't wait to try something else. His big break came when he attended college on a scholarship. He went to Dartmouth to study, to become a congregational minister. That was his plan. That was his ticket out of the small town in Connecticut. But at his very first probationary post on Long Island in the 1790s, he met a physician who had some fascinating ideas. And these ideas already put Palmer off of the traditional path towards being a minister. Dr. Isaac Ledyard had been reading about the biochemistry that was fascinating scientists in Europe. Physiologists and chemists and biologists were all trying to figure out what makes life happen, what makes matter move. They were looking under their microscopes. They wanted to know, why do cells split off and replicate? What makes nerve endings twitch? What causes this? What is this? And they began to speculate, is it maybe a kind of electricity, or is it more sort of a really magical fluid? What causes these actions? Is it a life juice of sorts? Well, Dr. Ledyard on Long Island concluded that this force, this life force, was actually a divine life force, and that it infused all the tiniest particles of matter. And that life force is what gets matter to go through its eternal permutations, making everything that has ever existed. So the cosmos, he thought, consists of matter in eternal motion. And Ledyard even dared to publish an essay about this, although anonymously, so as not to ruin his reputation as an upstanding Christian gentleman. In their conversations, though, Ledyard could lean into what this might mean, and Palmer, as an aspiring minister, took these insights in a theological direction. So if matter is eternal, and if matter is all there is, do immaterial souls really exist? in an immaterial place like heaven. So you can see what happened here. He followed these ideas, and for a while he tried to combine them with a kind of liberal Protestantism, one that moved away from a focus on sin and hell. And, up in the pulpit, he began to say that the best way to honor God was to be grateful and joyful and do kind things to other people, be celebratory, really. And he spoke less and less about Jesus and not at all about the supernatural miracles in the Bible, including the very important ones like the resurrection. His congregation noticed and they fired him. And at that point, Palmer, who loves to think about theology, loves to talk about it. He's a talker, right? He begins to travel around and preach wherever he can get the pulpit, wherever he can be a visiting minister. And what he has to say in those sermons is really that Jesus was fully human, morally perfect, yes, but not divine. And so he's beginning to take this message out to more and more people. And then in 1791, he moved to Philadelphia, the nation's capital, because there he's going to reach the most people. And at this point, he has a wife, he has 2 young sons, and things are looking up. And in fact, even his enemies, even the people who loathe his ideas, who abhor his heretical, blasphemous talk about Jesus as fully human, for example, they have to agree that he's a really fine speaker. He's eloquent. He's great with his intonation and his gestures and his cadence. He's expressive he's just terrific as a public speaker. And people come and they listen and they applaud at the end. I mean, he was terrific. He's having such a good time. And then he overstepped. And he overstepped in 1792, when he published an advertisement for the very things that he had been saying already. He published an advertisement in a local newspaper in Philadelphia for his upcoming speech against the divinity of Jesus Christ. And he put that in the newspaper and assumed it would be fine because he'd said as much in his lectures. He'd been saying it everywhere. And it's the nation's capital, the largest city in the US, and very diverse and very worldly. And as you all know, the First Amendment had just been ratified 1 year prior. So surely there would be no problem, right? Wrong. His advertisement created a kind of a test. What would the American public tolerate? And most importantly, what would the local ministers tolerate? Well, not so much, it turned out. And the first thing that happened was a very important minister in Philadelphia intimidated the landlord who had rented Palmer his lecture hall. He could no longer use it. And then what happened was that some ministers in town banded together and they crafted a campaign of character assassinations that took place in the newspapers. They even went so far as to publish on their own dime a 26-page pamphlet. And it got very ugly really fast. And now Palmer has been, well, sort of accidentally, he's outed himself with his advertisement as a free thinker and as an advocate for free speech. And so what happens is then a kind of print battle that gets waged in Philadelphia. And I thought maybe I would read to you a little bit of what Palmer has to say in his own defense, just so you can get maybe a sense of his writing and his style. So here we go from American Freethinker. He's just learned that he will no longer have the lecture hall. And so with the rented room close to him, he has a choice to make. He can retreat once more into the private sphere of free thinking conversation with his friends, or he can push forward into the public sphere and take his grievance to the newspapers. It took Palmer only a few hours, if that, to decide to go public and make it a matter of principle. At stake in the contest were freedom of conscience and freedom of expression. In his view, the matter was clear as day. The abuse lay on the side of those who infringed on his freedom of conscience and of speech by curtailing his access to a lecture venue. So he rather quickly penned a message titled "To the Public," and sent it to the General Advertiser. He was, here's the quote, "extremely sorry to inform the public that the gentleman from whom he engaged the house has taken an alarm at the novelty of his sentiment, and fearing a temporal injury has forbid his entrance into the house." Here, actually, Palmer fudged a bit, perhaps to protect the owner of the long room. The long room was the name of the lecture hall. The landlord may have been surprised by the public announcement of Palmer's intended speech against the divinity of Jesus, but not by the idea itself, which the landlord had most certainly heard Palmer express before. The part about fearing a temporal injury shifted the blame elsewhere, to unnamed persons who would harm the landlord's business if he allowed Palmer to speak in his establishment. Then Palmer made his main point. Religious prejudice drove the effort to silence him. Here he goes. "Despite the legal and nominal freedom that obtains in this country," Palmer said, "the spirit of persecution bear hard on the rights of conscience." And then with hyperbole, he described himself as persecuted for his freedom-loving principles nigh unto death. Quote, "But he does not despair," he wrote about himself in the third person, "for if his life is spared, he is determined to exert his feeble abilities to demolish the ancient fabric of superstition," unquote. Once Christianity had fallen, he would, here's a quote again, "erect on its ruins an immortal building guarded by the engines of truth, and on its front engraved in letters of gold, 'Virtue is the dignity of man.'" And he signed off with his name in all caps, Elihu Palmer. So there he is, deciding to step into this rather uncomfortable space of being a free thinker, a public speaker. And what happened next was that nobody backed him up. Nobody backed him up. He had been a participant in a group called the Deistical Society of Philadelphia. He'd spoken to 40 people at a time there, but everybody ducked. All of his free-thinking friends in Philadelphia lay low. And this is that self-censorship, right? And it's understandable. It's understandable that people don't want to be punished or called out or ridiculed. What it meant for Palmer, though, was that he was completely isolated. It was very lonely. It was a low point in his life. Nobody would hire him. He had no income for his wife and 2 boys. And so he decided to leave town for a while. He went and stayed with his brother in Wilkes-Barre, 100 miles away. But then 6 months later, he was back. He came back to Philadelphia in 1793, and he gave a speech on the 4th of July in which he called out clergy as oppressive hypocrites. I always think that if that speech had a soundtrack, it would be trumpets. He decided to lean into this and not to be cowed, but to speak his mind. And so he had decided to just sort of go forward as a single agent, really, right, by himself, when a few weeks later, an illness started spreading in Philadelphia. 1793, people sickened and died within days. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know how it spread. What could prevent this from happening? It killed whole families. It killed whole neighborhoods. 5,000 people died in Philadelphia, a town at the time of 45,000 people. It was a terrible, dreadful disease. It was the yellow fever. And it wouldn't be until 100 years later that people understood that it was spread by mosquitoes, that it was a virus that was carried by that insect. Well, Palmer got sick and his wife did too, and then she died, probably really quickly, probably in her mid-20s, leaving behind the 2 young boys. Palmer survived the yellow fever, but when he emerged out of the illness, he realized he had lost all of his eyesight. He was completely blinded, permanently and completely blinded by the fever. And some of his most pious neighbors knew why and told him so. He had been outspoken and blasphemous and heretical in his talk against the divinity of Jesus. He had advertised his disbelief in the newspapers. And so his blindness must be really divine punishment for his heresy. In fact, a friend of Palmer's recalled that his Christian neighbors showed little sympathy or disposition to lend a helping hand to soothe his misfortune. Indeed, some did not scruple to pronounce it a judgment of God for his unbelief. So much for Christian charity, Palmer might have thought. And his troubles were really dire. He couldn't work, so he couldn't take care of his children. He ended up bringing them to his father in Connecticut. And he'd lost everything, his family, his eyesight, his ability to work, but he was resilient. And he eventually made his way to New York City, where he met up with other freethinkers. And very importantly, he encountered a new book making the rounds, and that was Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, that bold, even crass, intentionally rude attack on all revealed religion, and especially Christianity. And Palmer noticed, as everybody else did at the time, that Paine used very colorful, accessible street language to make his points against the Bible, to try to peel people away from their faith of it. So he would attack the as ridiculous the notion of the miracles in order to try to say, clearly this is invented. The scriptures are not divine revelation, they are human fabrication. And as Paine put it, all revealed religions appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. Paine was mistaken for an atheist. In fact, he was a very, I think, devout, ardent deist. And he said it of himself. He said, the only true religion is deism, by which he meant the belief of one God and an imitation of his moral character, or the practice of what are called moral virtues. And what made Paine different from so many of the people who read his book, because it was a huge hit, although I think probably perhaps more for its shock value than because it persuaded so many people. But what made him distinctive was the notion that morality did not require a religious grounding. Because in the early American Republic, the more commonplace assumption was that a moral compass required a footing in some religious tradition, that one could not be without religion and still be a moral person, except that Paine was sure that one could. And so many people in America responded to this notion that religion was not only necessary, but was actually harmful. They responded to this with fear and loathing. But Elihu Palmer, he was all in. He found this made perfect sense. And at the same time, and the year is now 1796. So just as Palmer is in New York City and he's found free-thinking friends who are reading to him The Age of Reason, he also met a very interesting and eccentric Englishman named John Stuart. And John Stuart had the nickname Walking Stuart because he walked everywhere, but he had traveled widely, he was from England, but then he traveled to India, and he walked even all the way to what's now Thailand, and he walked through Northern Africa. He walked, enormous, put back an enormous path of travel. And when he returned first to England and then made his way to New York City, he brought with him some of the ideas he'd encountered there. And one of them was this notion that yes, everything that exists is made of eternal matter and it's constantly in motion. But to that, he added the theory that on the level of atoms, the tiniest particles known to people at the time, and they were not yet seen, but they were still called atoms, these atoms could perceive, they could register and remember pain. You think, why does this matter? Well, it matters because if everything is made of substance that moves around and constantly reformulates itself into every living thing, if it remembers a sensation, then harm done to one creature or individual when that is remembered on the level of atoms and contributes to the accumulating pain of the universe. It's unfamiliar to us today, I think, but to this, Stewart added another unusual idea, which is that we are all engaged in a constant exchange of atoms all the time. So sitting wherever you are right now, the atoms from you are in exchange with the atoms of the things all around you. And according to Stewart, they are bringing with them as they travel sensations of pain or comfort. So that means, and here's the radical idea, that means that what one does to others, one instantly also does to part of oneself and to the matter that makes up all things, which, if you think about it, really just means that there's a shared fate. What happens to one happens to all. What you do unto one, you do unto everything that will ever be. And Palmer thought this idea was a real game changer. Because if a person understood that we all share the same fate, then wouldn't that instantly change our behavior? He thought it would create a kind of benevolence, universal benevolence, he called it, towards everything in the universe. And then it instantly should also change behavior. So he thought that understanding this sort of mind shift about everything being made of the same substance and it being sensate would be enough to end wars, would be enough to end slavery, oppression of all kinds. And it would do this without shedding a single drop of blood. So during this era of the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, the real burning question for many was, how do we achieve radical social change without the guillotine, without a slave revolt that involves lots of death? You know, because especially when slaveholders resist the freedom of their human property, right? That's when it gets really bloody. And so how can we have social change without bloodshed? And Palmer said, by rethinking how we understand how we're related to everything. So regardless of what you think about this idea, the point is that Palmer thought it was radical. It was radical. And religions get in the way of this. Religions, he said, are superstitious. They're supernatural. They don't let you understand the science of things, the nature of things. Science, he thought, will eventually catch up. And in the meantime, you know, John Stewart was the greatest philosopher alive. So this was, you know, there you have it. 200 years before modern day radical ecology, Palmer thought that understanding the interconnected nature of all things would be enough to change human behavior. And he wrote a book. He dictated a book of some 300 pages. It's called Principles of Nature. And it shared this message along with his very Painite critique of the Bible, using the same kind of sarcastic, sardonic humor and a kind of pedantic literalism about how walking on water was impossible and so forth. So he copies Paine in that regard. Well, Palmer's book came out in 1801, and he sent it to Thomas Jefferson, sure that philosopher in the White House would appreciate it. And then the very next year, in 1802, Palmer was tarred as a dangerous atheist who headed up the New York Illuminati. This was an early conspiracy theory. It was a conspiracy theory that said the United States is being infiltrated by atheists from Europe, the same people who caused the French Revolution. And they are infiltrating reading societies in America. So when people gather for a book club, they are being targeted by these Illuminati who intend to run all the Christians out of public office and replace them with freethinkers. That same fall, as Palmer is becoming the most infamous public freethinker in America, given that Jefferson is being more discreet and being much more political about his views, given that, you know, Palmer is becoming kind of the poster child of a dangerous infidel. It's sort of interesting that in that moment, that effect is compounded when Paine returns to the United States after having been gone since 1787. Paine arrives in October of 1802. He doesn't find a warm welcome with his friend Jefferson. Paine was so excited about talking about his model bridge and catching up with his friend, but Jefferson knows better than to bring Paine, warmly into the White House. And so Paine eventually makes his way to New York City. He gets in with the same group of freethinkers that is Palmer's group of friends. The two had already corresponded about Palmer's book. And Palmer probably told Paine that he never heard back from Jefferson about the receipt of his book. And Jefferson was usually so good about his thank you notes, but not in this case, which is really remarkable, given that Jefferson is the author of the absolutely amazing milestone, the 1786 Virginia Statute for religious freedom, the man who loved to think skeptically about religion, who was extraordinarily daring and encouraged others in his circle to, dare to pursue your critical thoughts without fear of where they might lead. That same Jefferson did not want to be associated with either Paine or Palmer in any way, and the president chose caution instead. And of course, any modern day politician would certainly understand that, right? Appearances of piety remain relevant today. They seem to be mandatory. Every time we have a presidential election campaign, the candidates feel compelled to tell us where they stand, what their religious faith is, how serious they are about it, right? It's a kind of de facto religious test for public office. And sometimes I think, well, if Jefferson could see us now, might he wish that he'd set a stronger precedent himself for freedom of religion and freedom of speech about religion while he held the nation's highest public office. Then again, freedom of speech about religion was not guaranteed at the time. In fact, many states still had blasphemy laws on the books. They were actionable. They were sometimes put into practice. As late as 1811, a New Yorker named John Ruggles, spent time behind bars for declaring in a tavern that Jesus was an illegitimate bastard and his mother, therefore, a whore. So that kind of talk, could still get a person fined and in jail. So for those who dared to openly discredit Christian doctrine, charges of blasphemy hovered as a kind of potential threat. Elihu Palmer was spared legal persecution, and he did not suffer jail time, and nor was he fined for his open hostility toward Christianity, but it did always lurk as a threat, and it made him a kind of, a test case in the nation's experiment in free speech. And although he was not prohibited outright for preaching his unpopular ideas, his free-thinking lectures did come at the cost of his reputation. He wished to be regarded as a public intellectual. He didn't want to be a lunatic fringe guy. He wanted to be respected and admired for his speaking ability and for his ideas. But he had to choose. He had to choose between the social respectability he yearned for and the intellectual candor that he also desired. And Palmer eventually did embrace his role, I think, as a lightning rod for his critics. And I imagine that the attention that he got, even the negative attention, did in some ways affirm for him the unsettling impact of his message. And he was also a strong believer in American democracy. He really thought that freedom of religion and of speech would eventually prevail, that revealed religion would fall away, and make room for this other idea about an interconnected web of all living things. Well, he was wrong. As we know, revealed religion is done just fine. But I do think that he did his part in pushing the boundaries of free speech. His lectures, which then were published, took on a very important symbolic valence in the 1790s. They had the effect, I think, of expanding public tolerance for religious free thought, because every time he expressed his ideas without incurring punishment, his supporters could take heart, and his opponents gained practice in enduring speech they deplored. This is part of what's so necessary, right? But it was never without friction. And in fact, a friend of his once put it this way: a religious tornado, he said, has shaken the country on account of Mr. Palmer. Palmer witnessed 2 centuries ago what is still true today, that freedom of religion and freedom of speech about religion remain contested. Not everybody's sure it's a good idea. Not everybody's sure that one should show a slide about the Prophet Muhammad. And so these First Amendment rights exist because people continue to enact them. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And before I get into the sort of the meatier questions, one thing that made me sit up straight when I was reading the book was, can you tell people where Elihu Palmer's house was? Like where in New York City it would be today, I guess.
Oh, really? Really? You think I should give that away? I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, if you want something that will
yeah.
Again, it gave me a chill when I read it. If you read the book American Freethinker, we won't give it away, but Elihu Palmer, when he lived in New York City, his house.
You're not going to say it. You're not going to say it, right?
No, I'm not going to say it.
Okay,
But his house was in a place that today will make you, oh wow.
Yeah.
So, and the way you sort of phrased it and the way you talk about it in the book is very thoughtful. And it was like, wow, it's so ironic. So read the book and figure that one out. I won't spoil it. I almost did, but I won't. Another question I have, and this was more just, again, it struck me when reading the book, was in this time period, you could just go to a city, sort of rent out a room and pronounce yourself as a public intellectual, a speaker, and people would show up if they thought the topic was interesting.
Yeah, I think it was a really important way of showing oneself to be a man of substance, because these were all men in the 1790s. Right, so this is before Frances Wright arrives from England and does her scandalous thing, right? And it's before women suffragists do their scandalous thing later. But it was a way for a man of substance to show himself to be well-read, engaging, intriguing, entertaining, and skilled at the art of oratory. I mean, to be an orator was a thing. And they had attention spans like we can't even remember, right? And so what do you do all winter evening without your television? You go hear a speaker, and people had a lot of stamina to listen for hours to somebody who was highly qualified as a speaker. And so I think that, yes, people would also come from Europe as orators, and they would travel the country, and they'd gain renown as eloquent men of words. So yeah, that was something that people did.
Yeah, that was, it just struck me. I can't imagine just going to a city, renting out a room, and then announcing myself as, oh, please listen to me. But I have some questions from the chat. One from Christian Coates. So, did Palmer run into trouble from the Quaker community in Philadelphia?
Oh, that's such a good question. No, he did not. I don't know. I have not encountered any interactions that he had with the Quaker community, in fact. And perhaps they simply avoided him. I'm not sure. Yeah.
So one from Jamie O'Brien: how did he evade blasphemy charges, given that he was so public, even going as far as sharing his views with Jefferson?
He only got lucky. And I wonder sometimes if maybe, did somebody take pity on him because he was blind and poor? I mean, the man was impoverished. He would have to hold out his hat, and doing these public speeches was one way in which he could earn a little bit of money to pay back the people who let him live with them, or, helped pay for his boarding house, or, so I think he just got lucky because others were accused of blasphemy. So I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. One question that I have is, in the book, you talk about how he lived in Georgia for a while. And I got the impression that the people in Georgia seemed a little more accepting of his more radical or fringe beliefs than a lot of the people in Philadelphia or up north. Is that sort of, am I accurate in coming away with that impression? Or, and if so, what is the cause of that? You would think that today, the South has a reputation of being a more closed-minded place. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that's very observant on your part. Well, I think that he was not, I think he was still trying to pass himself off as a minister when he was in Augusta, Georgia. It was between leaving his probationary post and heading to Philadelphia that he was first in Georgia. And I think that, it's amazing. He nudged the actual sitting minister in the Episcopalian church in Georgia out of his pulpit every other Sunday. Somehow Palmer was such a good preacher that he got equal time in the pulpit, and Palmer was never even ordained. I mean, he really, he must have been good, or the other poor fellow must have been not such a good preacher. But so there's Palmer every other Sunday. And I think that at the time he was not yet talking about what he learned from John Stewart. He was not yet talking about, everything being made up of sensate matter and atoms jumping one to the other and all that. I think that was not part of his spiel, but I do think that he was already very interested in talking about Jesus as a fully human, if perfect specimen, who was maybe here on a divine mission. He may still have included talk like that. So I think he was certainly not as hostile to Christianity as he would later be. I think he was still trying to pass as some kind of universalist.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question from my mom. Thanks, Mom, for joining. Love you. You mentioned this idea of atheists. I'm quoting my mom. You mentioned this idea of atheists infiltrating the United States. Where do you think this persistent idea of an Illuminati or quote unquote deep state idea originates from? It feels like this has been a consistent idea that a small group of people control the world and we're all just a victim of their tyranny.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Where does it come from? Well, it seems like it comes from a doubt about the possibility of democracies to fend off such attacks. I mean, it seems like maybe it comes from the notion that there are vulnerabilities in a democracy and that these can be exploited. And maybe it's not all wrong, right? In a crazy way, like, aren't we witnessing now sort of vulnerabilities of our democracy that can be exploited and twisted in really bad ways, right? So I don't know exactly where it comes from. That is a very good question. I do know that there are moments when this fear seems to really be heightened, and when anxiety in general is really heightened. And that's certainly true in the late 1790s, when the question is, will this very new, still untested nation survive? Will it be able to endure the pummeling that's sure to come, either with overt aggression with armies, or through a kind of sneaky, oblique form of undermining the ways in which the society functions? Cannot answer that really good question.
Yeah, that's a whole. My mom asked me a lot of questions that stumped me. But that's a whole book right there, right? Like like you could many books perhaps. Note from Christian, interesting parallel. Dolly Madison also survived the yellow fever epidemic in Philly in 1793. Also lost a spouse and child on the same day. It's interesting. I did not know that. And from Megan Sylvester, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm curious as to what led you to this researching the life of Elihu Palmer and what different sources you used. I know you mentioned newspapers and lectures.
Okay, so I was going to write a book about Thomas Paine, I thought. Actually, this goes way back. This is one of those books that took me a very, very long time to write. And initially I thought, I was going to write about the framers, not to say founding fathers, right? It's so patriarchal, but the framers of the Constitution and their religious beliefs and how this played into things like the First Amendment. And then I realized I wasn't sure that I would have anything really new to add to that very rich conversation. And then I began to think about Thomas Paine. And then I came across this man, Palmer, who seemed to be kind of a sidekick of Paine's. He seemed to be kind of like a friend in New York City. And then Paine had written this, I'm sorry, not Paine, all these P's. Palmer had written this book, Principles of Nature. So I went to read it just because I'd never heard of the man, never heard of the book. So I'm sitting in the American Antiquarian Society reading Principles of Nature. And I realized that I don't understand what he's saying. I don't understand this talk of atoms. I have no idea where he's coming from. And what I especially don't understand is, why is he so excited about this? The man was transported. He was transported with joy about what this would mean, the message he had and how it would change the world. And I just thought, what? I don't get this. Anyway, I continued to not understand it, but then I was intrigued. And it was only when I began to read the work of these now totally obscure people, Isaac Ledyard, John Stewart, like these are not people who we still remember at all. They were not famous in their day, and they're even more obscure now. But I began to read their work, and I began to understand that Palmer was saying something that was kind of unrecognizable in his day. It was so off the charts that there was really no word for it. And eventually, in the 19th century, this idea gets a name, and it's called vitalism. It's this, and then the transcendentalists run with it and others run with it. And there's this, right? So vitalism was really still a kind of scientific endeavor in this age. And it's Palmer who says, wait, it's also a theological matter. Anyway, so I kind of got hooked on that. And then there was nothing on him. That his friend, John Fellows, wrote an 8-page bio of his buddy Palmer after Palmer died at a young age. And those 8 pages were all we had. We didn't know where he was born or where he grew up or anything about him. And so I told the press, University of Pennsylvania Press, even as late as 2016, it came out in 21, I think, but even as late as that, I said, I can't do a biography. I don't have enough material on him. This is going to have to be a book about his ideas. And then it occurred to me, I might find something if I looked in the papers of people who maybe knew him, which takes forever, because then you're looking through all of these letters looking for the name Elihu or Palmer, right? And occasionally, though, I would land on something, and then I discovered the fight in Philadelphia because the ministers are conspiring, so they're writing letters to each other about how they're going to take this guy down. And then I took my rental car up to northeastern Connecticut, and I had a list of names on headstones in ancient cemeteries in Connecticut. And then one day I found the right Palmer family. I found their headstones. And once I had found his town of origin, then I could go to the state archives and I could see church records and state records, and I could figure out his whole family configuration. And I even found, this is amazing, the manuscript diary of his childhood minister. And in fact, the whole first chapter is based on all of these other bits of evidence to explain why Palmer, might have become a free thinker, why he's encouraged by his family to not become, a great awakening type figure, why in fact taking off for college is just going to be his ticket out. Anyway, so all of these circumstantial things, but it's the kind of project where, it could never have been a first book because I was on the tenure club. This was a second book where I could just totally indulge myself and go down all kinds of rabbit holes, and then occasionally find the perfect little piece of this puzzle. And it was super fun. It was a blast. It was kind of addictive, actually. I mean, it was really hard to stop looking. I never got to go to Augusta, for example. I never did myself go to Dartmouth I was in touch with archivists in both places and they helped me out. But really, this is the kind of gradual accrual of tiny little pieces of shards of information from this guy. And it's a brand new telling of his life. And I really think it's amazing because he was once infamous, but because he didn't leave behind an archive, he hasn't had his historians. And then, it just takes sort of doggedness and what a friend of mine calls butt in chair stamina in the archive to get it done. Also, very helpful, the optical character recognition feature that we now have, where you can go through newspapers. I spent a whole summer going through newspapers online looking for Palmers, not just Elihu, not just Reverend, because sometimes he doesn't show up with his name Elihu. So all the Palmers ever written about in early American newspapers, I think I have seen them. And then that led me to little tidbits about how he met his wife, for example. There might be a little bit of shipping news about Reverend Palmer with his wife is heading from New York to Georgia. Newspapers helped me track his movements across state lines. I mean, it's that kind of thing. It's just an obsession.
Yeah, and one thing that I loved about this book in particular is it's full of a very unique cast of characters in terms of a history book. It's very kooky. And I hope I don't insult, I don't hope I don't disrespect any of the historical characters in the book, but it's full of very eccentric sort of people that like you never really think about when you think about past eras, that like sort of free thinkers existed, throughout all of history. And speaking of a interesting character, a question in the chat, did he have any interactions with James Madison at all? Or do we have any indication that Madison knew about him or anything like that?
Not Madison, no. But if this were a movie, his story would be a great movie, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not the one to write a movie, screenplay, but it would make a great movie, and it would have cameo appearances from not only Jefferson, who at least got the book, it's in his library, but also Washington. Washington comes through town when Palmer's in Augusta, and witnesses the exams the public exams that the students needed to give to graduate, and was super impressed with their eloquence and their oratory skills and their Latin, which they have learned from visiting Professor Palmer. So Palmer was there when Washington comes through. And then there are some other people of greater renown. Early Americanists know Jedediah Morse in Charlestown, Massachusetts, one of the great nemesis of Palmer. So there are other people who could make great cameo appearances. Madison isn't one of them. I wish I could invent it, but it's history, not fiction.
What parallels, we'll end with this question, because this kind of brings us back to the modern day, sort of how you started, and so we'll end with this. What parallels, if any, do you see with the struggle for religious freedom or free thinking in the 1800s with the struggle today?
Well, it's still true, I think, that Americans accuse other Americans of holding religious beliefs that are possibly not patriotic, that might even be seditious. I mean, 2017, the Muslim ban, right? Remember that, right? What was the notion that people coming from Muslim-dominated countries might be a danger to the country? Why? Like, what? So the ways in which some religions are still suspect, as if one could not be a loyal American patriot and also an X or Y or Z. That notion is so long-standing. How do we still live with that, right? That's so interesting to me, that idea is still somehow coursing through in a subterranean fashion. Sometimes it bursts out and is very overt about how some religions are just less American than others. That's remarkable. And that's a direct parallel, I think. Also, the ways in which, so interesting. I mean, the notion that some people's religious feelings might merit an extra dollop of respect. That's really interesting to me. And I'm thinking about how, the Hamlin president said that the Orthodox Muslim students' religious convictions really, and I'm paraphrasing now, and so do not quote me on this, but they really sort of superseded in that moment the imperatives of academic free speech. So that's a matter of respect. It's not a matter of law, but it's a matter, the instructor should not have shown that image. Well, that's exactly the same kind of argument that was levied against people in New York City in 2011 who wanted to establish a Muslim community center with a mosque in it within blocks of the World Trade Center location, right? And so the neighbors who did not want a Muslim community center in that area of Manhattan said, you people who plan on building this thing, who've already bought the property, you should not, because you should respect the feelings of families who lost somebody that day, 9/11, in the attack. But the people who wanted to build the community center had nothing to do with the attack. They were also Muslim. That was it, right? So the notion of, that somehow some people's religious feelings merit more respect maybe than free speech, that's sort of also a long-standing, interesting parallel, perhaps. I think this sounds like somebody should write an essay about this. I don't know that I'm volunteering, but the parallels are very interesting, and some things just have not been fully thought through, and so therefore they remain unresolved and can be deployed, right, in an argument.
Yeah, I think sum up Christian in the chat. You just volunteered, so
I
we're
did
looking
not.
forward to that. Yeah.